Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a vast American prairie, sometime around 1870. The sun has just dipped below the horizon. There are no streetlights flickering to life. There are no glowing windows from neighboring houses casting warm rectangles of light onto manicured lawns. There is no distant hum of a power grid, no buzzing transformers on wooden poles, no neon signs advertising late-night diners. There is nothing but the sky above you, an impossibly deep and star-filled sky, the kind of sky that modern Americans have almost entirely forgotten exists. The Milky Way stretches from one horizon to the other like a river of crushed diamonds, and you can see so many stars that the constellations are actually hard to pick out because there are too many points of light competing for your attention. Now imagine that this darkness, this profound and total darkness, is not a camping trip. It is not a power outage that will be fixed in a few hours. It is not a romantic evening designed to be temporary. This is your life. This is every single night of your life. This is every single night of every single life that has ever been lived on this continent up until a remarkably recent moment in human history. This is the story of what life was actually like before electricity transformed America, and it is a story so foreign, so strange, and so filled with details that will genuinely astonish you that it almost feels like we are talking about a different planet rather than the same country that now burns through more electricity than almost any nation on Earth. Let yourself settle in, let your breathing slow, and let me take you back year by year, detail by detail, into the America that existed before someone figured out how to tame lightning and send it through wires into every home, every business, and every corner of daily life. To understand what life was like before electricity, you have to understand something that sounds almost philosophical, but is actually deeply practical. For the vast majority of human history, darkness was not merely an inconvenience, it was a force. It was a governing principle of daily existence. It dictated when you woke up, when you worked, when you ate, when you socialized, and when you slept. Darkness was, in a very real sense, the most powerful authority in the world, more powerful than any king or president, because no human being could overrule it. In America before electricity, the average person's day was structured almost entirely around the sun. When the sun rose, you rose. When the sun set, your productive day was, for all practical purposes, over. Yes, there were candles and oil lamps and eventually gas lighting in some cities, but these were feeble, expensive, dangerous, and limited tools that pushed back the darkness only slightly, the way a single match pushes back the darkness of a cave. The darkness always won. It always came back. And it shaped every single aspect of American life in ways that we have almost completely forgotten. Consider this single astonishing fact. In the winter months in the northern United States, the sun sets as early as 4:30 in the afternoon. That means that for a farmer in Vermont or Minnesota or Wisconsin in the year 1850, the working day ended before what we would now consider the middle of the afternoon. By 5 o'clock, it was dark. By 6 o'clock, it was profoundly dark. And that darkness would last for 14 or 15 hours until the sun rose again the next morning around 7 or 7:30. What did people do during those 14 or 15 hours of darkness? The honest answer for most Americans was remarkably little. They ate a simple supper by the light of a single candle or a small fire. They might do a small amount of handwork, mending clothes, or whittling or knitting if they could afford to burn a candle long enough. They talked quietly with family members, they prayed, and then they went to sleep, often astonishingly early by our standards. 8 o'clock bedtimes were common, 7 o'clock bedtimes were not unusual. And in the deepest parts of winter, some families were in bed by 6 o'clock in the evening, not because they were tired, but because there was literally nothing else they could do, and because fuel and candles were too precious to waste. This is one of the first great revelations about pre-electric America. People slept far more than we do. Historical sleep researchers, particularly a brilliant historian named Roger E. Kirch, have documented that Americans before electricity routinely slept 9, 10, even 12 hours per night during winter months. But they did not sleep the way we sleep. They practiced something that Eckersh calls segmented sleep or biphasic sleep, a pattern so universal and so well documented that it forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about natural human sleep patterns. Here is how it worked. A family would go to bed shortly after dark, perhaps at 8 or 9 o'clock. They would sleep for 3 or 4 hours. Then, sometime around midnight or 1 in the morning, they would wake up. Not because of an alarm clock or a noise or a disturbance, but naturally as part of their normal sleep cycle. They would be awake for 1 to 2 hours. During this period of wakefulness, which was so common it had its own name, people called it the watching or simply referred to first sleep and second sleep. They would do quiet activities. They would pray. They would reflect on dreams they had just had. Couples would talk intimately. Some people would get up and do small chores. Some would smoke a pipe. Some would visit neighbors who were also awake during this same period, because everyone in the community knew about and experienced this same pattern. Then, after an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, they would fall back asleep for their second sleep, which would last until dawn. This two-phase sleep pattern was so deeply embedded in pre-electric American culture that references to first sleep and second sleep appear constantly in diaries, letters, court records, and medical texts from the colonial period through the 19th century. It was not considered unusual or unhealthy. It was simply how human beings slept when their sleep was governed by natural darkness rather than artificial light. The disappearance of segmented sleep is one of the most profound and least discussed consequences of electrification. When electric lights made it possible to stay awake comfortably until 10 or 11 o'clock at night, the long stretch of darkness that had allowed for two distinct sleep phases was compressed. People started going to bed later and sleeping in one consolidated block. Within a single generation after widespread electrification, segmented sleep had virtually disappeared from American culture, and within 2 generations, it had been so thoroughly forgotten that modern sleep researchers initially dismissed historical references to it as confused or metaphorical. But let us stay in the darkness a while longer, because the darkness of pre-electric America was not merely about sleep, it was about fear. We modern Americans have almost no concept of how frightening true darkness was. We have nightlights and streetlights and headlights and the ambient glow of cities reflecting off clouds. Even in rural areas, there is almost always some source of artificial light visible somewhere. But in pre-electric America, particularly in rural areas, which is where the vast majority of Americans lived, nighttime darkness was absolute in a way that is almost impossible to describe. When you stepped outside your cabin or farmhouse on a moonless night in rural America before electricity, you could not see your hand in front of your face. This is not an exaggeration. This is a literal, physical fact. On a cloudy, moonless night, Without any artificial light source, human vision is essentially useless. You cannot see the ground beneath your feet. You cannot see the trees around you. You cannot see the fence that you built with your own hands 20 feet from your front door. You navigate entirely by memory and touch, and every step is uncertain. This darkness had real and terrifying consequences. People fell into wells, they walked off cliffs, they stumbled into rivers and drowned. They got lost in their own fields and wandered for hours trying to find their way back to a house they could not see. Court records from colonial and early American history are filled with inquests into deaths that occurred because someone went outside after dark and met some terrible accident that would have been trivially avoidable in daylight. The darkness also meant that crime, when it happened, was almost impossible to investigate or prevent. If someone committed a crime after dark, there were no witnesses because no one could see anything. Criminals operated with near total impunity in the darkness, and this was so well understood that many colonial laws imposed harsher penalties for crimes committed at night, on the theory that nighttime criminals were more dangerous and more deliberately wicked because they were exploiting the darkness as a tool. The darkness shaped architecture too. Pre-electric American houses were designed with an awareness of darkness that we have completely lost. Rooms were smaller than we might expect, not because people wanted small rooms, but because a single candle or oil lamp could only illuminate a small space effectively. A large room lit by a single candle would have pools of deep shadow in every corner, making it feel eerie and uncomfortable. Small rooms concentrated the available light and made the space feel warm and inhabited. Fireplaces were centrally located not just for heat distribution, but because the fire was often the primary light source for the household. Families gathered around the fireplace in the evening, not merely for warmth, but because it was the brightest spot in the house. The phrase hearth and home carried a literal meaning that we have lost. The hearth was the center of the home because it was the center of light. Windows were positioned with extraordinary care. A south-facing window was a precious asset because it admitted the maximum amount of sunlight during the day. Rooms that needed the most light, like kitchens where detailed work was done, were placed on the south side of the house. Rooms where less light was needed, like bedrooms, were placed on the north side. The orientation of an entire house was determined by the path of the sun, a consideration that modern architects rarely think about because electric lighting has made natural light orientation largely irrelevant. The colors inside pre-electric homes tell their own story. Walls were often whitewashed or painted in light colors, not because of aesthetic preference, but because light-colored walls reflected the limited available light more effectively. A whitewashed wall could double the effective illumination of a single candle by bouncing light back into the room. Dark-colored walls absorbed light and made rooms feel even darker. The preference for light-colored interiors in early American homes was not a fashion choice, it was a survival strategy. If the darkness of pre-electric America was oppressive, the cost of fighting it was staggering. Light, in all its forms, was one of the most significant expenses in an American household. And the story of how Americans paid for light before electricity is a fascinating journey through economics, ecology, and ingenuity. Let us start with the simplest and oldest form of artificial light, the open fire. Every American household had at least one fireplace. And in many homes, the fire served as both the primary heat source and the primary light source. But maintaining a fire was not free. It required an enormous amount of wood. Historical estimates suggest that a typical American household in the 18th and early 19th centuries burned between 20 and 40 cords of wood per year. A cord of wood is a stack 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long. 40 cords of wood is a staggering amount of fuel, and cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking that much wood was one of the most time-consuming and physically demanding tasks in American life. The labor required to keep fires burning was so immense that it has been estimated that the average American farmer spent between 1 and 2 full months of labor per year just procuring firewood. That is 1/6 to 1/8 of the entire working year devoted to a single task, and the primary product of that task, beyond heat, was light. The fire in the hearth was often the only light source that a family could afford to use freely, because unlike candles or oil, the wood was being burned anyway for warmth. Candles were the next step up in lighting technology, and they were shockingly expensive relative to the incomes of ordinary Americans. There were two main types of candles available in pre-electric America: tallow candles and beeswax candles. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat, usually beef or mutton fat. They were the cheaper option, but cheaper is a relative term. Making tallow candles was a miserable, time-consuming, and foul-smelling process. The fat had to be carefully rendered, which meant slowly heating it to separate the pure fat from the meat, gristle, and other tissues. The rendering process produced a stench that was legendary in its awfulness, a heavy, greasy, nauseatingly sweet smell that permeated clothing, hair, and skin and lingered for days. Rendering day was dreaded by everyone in the household, and for good reason. Once the tallow was rendered, it had to be formed into candles, either by dipping wicks repeatedly into the liquid tallow, building up layers one thin coat at a time, or by pouring the tallow into molds. Dipping was the more common method for home production, and it was extraordinarily tedious. Each candle required dozens of individual dips, with drying time between each dip, and a single day of candle making might produce only a few dozen candles. An average household might need 200 to 400 candles per year, which meant that candle making was a multi-day annual project that consumed significant time and resources. And tallow candles, after all that labor, were terrible light sources. They produced a dim, yellowish, flickering light that was only marginally better than firelight. They dripped constantly, leaving pools of greasy residue on tables and floors. They smoked and smelled bad, filling rooms with a faint but persistent odor of burning animal fat. They attracted insects. They required constant attention because the wick had to be trimmed regularly. If the wick was too long, the candle would smoke and flicker. If it was too short, the flame would gutter and threaten to go out. There was a special tool called a wick trimmer or snuffer that was a standard household implement. And tending the candles was such a constant task that it spawned its own vocabulary and customs. Beeswax candles were vastly superior. They burned brighter, cleaner, and longer. They smelled pleasant rather than foul. They did not drip as much, but they were ruinously expensive. Beeswax was a luxury commodity, and beeswax candles cost 5 to 10 times as much as tallow candles. They were used primarily by the wealthy and by churches. The phrase, "not worth the candle," comes from this era and originally meant that a task was not important enough to justify the expense of burning a candle while performing it. For the very poor, even tallow candles were an unaffordable luxury. Many American households, particularly on the frontier, relied on even more primitive light sources. One common option was the rushlight, which was made by soaking dried rushes, a type of wetland plant, in leftover cooking grease and then burning them in a special holder. Rushlights were essentially free to make, but they produced an almost pathetically small amount of light and burned for only 15 to 20 minutes each. A family using rushlights as their primary evening illumination would need to keep a large supply on hand and would spend the evening replacing burned out rushes with fresh ones in a tedious and barely adequate ritual. Another common light source, particularly in frontier areas, was the pine knot. Certain types of pine wood, particularly heartwood that was saturated with resin, would burn with a bright, if smoky, flame. Families would collect pine knots and burn them in the fireplace or in special holders called candlewood holders. Pine knots were free for the gathering in forested areas, but they produced enormous amounts of smoke and soot, blackening ceilings and walls and filling rooms with a haze that irritated eyes and lungs. In coastal areas, particularly in New England, another light source was available that sounds almost unbelievable to modern ears. Certain types of small oily fish, particularly a fish called the candlefish or eulachon, were so saturated with oil that they could literally be dried, fitted with a wick, and burned like a candle. This was not a metaphor or an exaggeration. The dried fish actually functioned as a candle, burning with a steady, if somewhat fishy-smelling flame. This practice was learned from Native American communities who had used candlefish for illumination for thousands of years before European contact. The economics of light in pre-electric America are perhaps best understood through a remarkable calculation that the economist William Nordhaus performed in a famous paper on the history of lighting. Nordhaus calculated the cost of light throughout history in terms of how many hours a person would have to work to earn enough money to buy 1 hour of light, equivalent to a modern 100-watt bulb. The results are staggering. In the early 19th century, using tallow candles, an average American worker would have to labor for approximately 6 hours to earn enough money to buy the candles needed to produce 1 hour of light equivalent to a modern light bulb. 6 hours of work for 1 hour of adequate light. This means that if you wanted to light your home for 5 hours in the evening, you would need to work 30 hours, nearly an entire work week, just to pay for the lighting. By comparison, using modern electric lighting, an average American worker today needs to work for approximately half a second to earn enough money to buy 1 hour of equivalent light. The ratio is almost incomprehensible. Light has become approximately 50,000 times cheaper since the early 19th century. This is one of the most dramatic decreases in the cost of any commodity in the entire history of human civilization, and it is almost entirely attributable to the invention and spread of electric lighting. Because light was so expensive, Americans before electricity were extraordinarily careful with it. They did not leave candles burning in empty rooms. They did not light candles for casual purposes. Every flame was precious, and extinguishing a candle was the last thing done before leaving a room, the way we might turn off an expensive appliance. Children were taught from earliest childhood to be respectful of fire and light, not just because of the fire danger, but because of the cost. The arrival of whale oil in the late 18th and early 19th centuries represented a significant improvement in lighting technology, but it came at an enormous ecological and human cost. Sperm whale oil in particular burned with a cleaner, brighter flame than tallow and became the premium lighting fuel for affluent Americans. The sperm whale's head contained a waxy substance called spermaceti that could be made into superb candles, the best available before the development of petroleum products. The demand for whale oil drove one of the most extraordinary and brutal industries in American history, the whaling industry. From ports like Nantucket, New Bedford, and Sag Harbor, American whaling ships sailed to every ocean on Earth in search of sperm whales and other species whose oil could be burned in lamps and made into candles. At its peak in the 1840s and 1850s, the American whaling fleet numbered over 700 ships, and the industry employed tens of thousands of men who spent years at sea in conditions of extreme danger and hardship. Whaling voyages typically lasted 2 to 4 years. Men left their families, their homes, and everything familiar and sailed into some of the most dangerous waters on the planet, pursuing animals that were fully capable of destroying the small boats from which they were hunted. The mortality rate among whalers was staggering. Ships were lost to storms, to ice, to fire, and occasionally to the whales themselves, as the famous case of the Essex, which inspired Herman Melville's Moby Dick, dramatically demonstrated. All of this, all of the voyages and the danger and the killing and the years away from home was done primarily so that Americans could have light. The whale oil that was the primary product of the whaling industry was used almost exclusively for illumination. Americans were, in essence, hunting the largest animals on Earth to extinction so that they could read books and sew clothes after dark. It is one of the most remarkable and sobering examples of the lengths to which human beings will go to push back the darkness. The price of whale oil tells the story of the industry's rise and decline. In the early 1800s, sperm whale oil sold for about 40 cents per gallon. By the 1850s, as whale populations declined and ships had to travel farther and farther to find them, the price had risen to over $2 per gallon. At its peak, whale oil was one of the most valuable commodities in America, and the whaling ports of New England were among the wealthiest communities in the country. Then, in 1859, everything changed. Edwin Drake drilled the first successful oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and within a few years, kerosene refined from petroleum had largely replaced whale oil as America's primary lighting fuel. Kerosene was cheaper, more abundant, and could be produced without sending men on multi-year voyages to the far corners of the earth. The whaling industry collapsed with astonishing speed, and the great whaling ports fell into decline. Kerosene lamps represented the pinnacle of pre-electric lighting technology. A good kerosene lamp could produce a steady, reasonably bright light that was far superior to candles or whale oil lamps. The argand lamp and later the flat-wick kerosene lamp became standard fixtures in American homes in the second half of the 19th century, and they remained the primary source of artificial light in rural America well into the 20th century, long after electric lighting had become standard in cities. But kerosene lamps had their own problems, and the most serious of these was the constant, ever-present, terrifying danger of fire. Fire was the great terror of pre-electric America, and it is almost impossible to overstate how pervasive and how devastating this danger was. Every single source of artificial light before electricity involved an open flame. Candles, oil lamps, gas lamps, kerosene lamps, fireplaces, all of them produce light by burning something, and all of them could, and regularly did, set houses, businesses, and entire cities ablaze. The statistics are numbing in their horror. In the 19th century, fire was one of the leading causes of death in America, particularly among women and children. Women were especially vulnerable because their clothing, the long, voluminous dresses and skirts that fashion and social convention demanded, was extraordinarily flammable. A woman bending over a candle to read or sew could ignite her sleeve or her bodice in an instant. A woman walking past a fireplace could catch her skirt on a stray ember. A mother reaching across a table where a candle was burning could set her hair on fire. The frequency of these incidents is heartbreaking. Historical records are filled with accounts of women and girls who burned to death in their own homes simply because their clothing caught fire from a routine light source. One study of death records from the 19th century found that death by fire and burns was the second leading cause of accidental death for women after only drowning. The phrase "she caught fire" appears in diaries, letters, and newspaper accounts with a regularity that is deeply disturbing to modern readers. Children were equally vulnerable. In an era before childproofing, before safety regulations, and before electric lighting made open flames unnecessary, children lived in constant proximity to fire. Toddlers knocked over candles. Children playing near fireplaces ignited their clothing. Older children carrying candles upstairs to bed tripped and dropped them, starting fires that could consume an entire house. Infant mortality from burns was shockingly high, and the fear of a child catching fire was one of the most persistent anxieties of parenthood in pre-electric America. Kerosene lamps, despite their superior illumination, were in some ways even more dangerous than candles because they contained a reservoir of flammable liquid. If a kerosene lamp was knocked over, which happened with depressing frequency, the kerosene would spill, ignite, and spread fire across surfaces with terrifying speed. Kerosene lamp explosions were also a real hazard. If the fuel reservoir became too hot, or if the kerosene was adulterated with more volatile substances like gasoline, which unscrupulous merchants sometimes did to stretch their profits, the lamp could explode, spraying burning kerosene across a room and its occupants. One of the most infamous examples of fire danger in pre-electric America was the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which destroyed approximately 3.5 square miles of the city, killed an estimated 300 people, and left more than 100,000 people homeless. While the exact cause of the fire has never been definitively established, the legendary account attributes it to a cow kicking over a kerosene lantern in a barn. Whether or not this specific detail is true, the broader point is unassailable. The fire started because of the open flame lighting technology that was universally used in pre-electric America. And it spread so catastrophically because virtually every building in the city was full of the same flammable materials, wood, fabric, paper, kerosene, that made open flame lighting so dangerous. The Great Chicago Fire was only the most famous of many devastating urban fires in pre-electric America. The Great Fire of New York in 1835 destroyed virtually every building in Lower Manhattan south of Wall Street. The Great Fire of Portland, Maine in 1866 destroyed approximately 1,500 buildings and left 10,000 people homeless, one-third of the city's population. The Great Fire of Boston in 1872 destroyed 65 acres of the city's commercial district. In almost every case, the fires started from or were accelerated by the open flame lighting and heating systems that were the only options available before electricity. Rural America was equally vulnerable. though rural fires typically destroyed individual homes and barns rather than entire city blocks. Barn fires were especially common and especially devastating because barns were filled with dry hay and straw, which ignited explosively when exposed to an open flame. A single lantern left burning in a barn could start a fire that would consume the barn, all the animals inside it, and potentially the farmhouse as well, in a matter of minutes. Entire families lost everything: their home, their livestock, their stored food, their tools, their clothing, in a single overnight fire started by a lamp that was knocked over by a restless horse or a gust of wind. The constant danger of fire shaped American behavior and culture in ways that we have largely forgotten. People were taught from earliest childhood to be hypervigilant about open flames. The last task of every evening, performed with religious devotion, was to make absolutely certain that every candle was extinguished, every lamp was turned down, and every ember in the fireplace was safely banked. The phrase "putting out the light" was not a casual expression, it was a survival ritual. Also shaped architecture. The spacing between buildings in early American towns was partly determined by fire safety considerations. Firewalls, thick brick or stone walls designed to stop a fire from spreading from one building to the next, were an important architectural feature. Roof materials were chosen partly for their fire resistance, with slate and tile roofs being preferred over wooden shingles in areas where fire was a particular concern. The design of chimneys was a matter of life and death, because a poorly designed chimney could send sparks onto a wooden roof and start a fire that would destroy the entire house. Firefighting in pre-electric America was a desperate, often futile struggle against an enemy that had every advantage. Volunteer fire companies, which were the primary firefighting organizations in most American communities, relied on hand-pumped engines, bucket brigades, and sheer physical courage to fight fires that were often already out of control by the time they arrived. Communication was the first problem. Before telephones, there was no way to quickly summon firefighters. Church bells would be rung to alert the community, but by the time the volunteers assembled, gathered their equipment, and reached the scene, precious minutes had been lost. Water supply was the second problem. Before pressurized water systems, which were themselves dependent on pumping technology that would eventually be powered by electricity, water for firefighting had to be drawn from wells, cisterns, rivers, or ponds and transported to the fire in buckets or hand-drawn pumper wagons. The volume of water that could be delivered by these methods was grossly inadequate for fighting a serious structural fire. Many fires burned until they simply ran out of fuel, with firefighters focusing their efforts on wetting down adjacent buildings to prevent the fire from spreading, rather than attempting to extinguish the blaze itself. The psychological impact of living with this constant fire danger is difficult for modern Americans to appreciate. Every night, as families extinguished their lights and settled into bed, there was a background anxiety about fire that never fully went away. A smell of smoke in the middle of the night would bring an entire household to panicked alertness. The creak of a house settling on a cold night could trigger a surge of fear, and the sight of a distant orange glow on the horizon, visible through a bedroom window, was one of the most terrifying sights in pre-electric America, because it meant that someone's world was ending in flames, and that the fire might be headed your way. Without electricity, the seasons dominated American life with an authority that is hard for modern Americans to comprehend. Today, We experience the seasons primarily as variations in weather and as occasions for different recreational activities. We ski in winter and swim in summer, but our fundamental daily routines, our work schedules, our sleeping patterns, our food, our social activities are largely the same year-round because electric lighting, heating, cooling, and refrigeration have insulated us from the extremes of the seasonal cycle. In pre-electric America, the seasons were not background variations. They were governing forces that reshaped every aspect of daily life 4 times a year. Summer was the season of maximum productivity and minimum sleep. In June and July, the sun rose before 5 o'clock in the morning and did not set until after 8 o'clock at night, providing 15 or more hours of daylight. Farmers, who constituted the vast majority of Americans through most of the pre-electric era, worked from dawn to dusk, which meant 15-hour or 16-hour workdays during the summer months. This was not workaholism or exploitation, though exploitation certainly existed. It was simple necessity. The crops had to be planted, tended, and harvested during the growing season, and every hour of daylight was precious. Summer was also the season of greatest social activity, precisely because the long daylight hours allowed time for socializing after the day's work was done. Evening gatherings, outdoor meals, community events, all were concentrated in the summer months when there was still light in the sky after supper. The tradition of summer festivals, county fairs, and outdoor celebrations in America has its roots in this simple, practical reality. Summer was when people had time and light for socializing. But summer had its own miseries in pre-electric America, miseries that modern Americans with their air conditioning and electric fans have largely escaped. The heat was inescapable. There were no electric fans to circulate air. There was no air conditioning to lower the temperature. Houses became stifling hot boxes, especially on the upper floors, where heat accumulated relentlessly. Families often moved their sleeping arrangements outdoors in the hottest weeks of summer, sleeping on porches, in yards, or even on rooftops in the cities, seeking whatever slight breeze might provide relief. Insects were another summer torment that electricity would eventually help alleviate. Without window screens, which did not become widely available until the late 19th century, and which were more practical once electric lights replaced the open flames that would have been placed near windows, flying insects invaded homes freely. Mosquitoes, flies, and moths were constant companions, and the diseases they carried, including malaria, which was endemic in much of the United States through the 19th century, made summer the deadliest season in many American communities. Food preservation was a constant summer crisis. Without refrigeration, food spoiled rapidly in the heat. Meat that was not salted, smoked, or dried would begin to rot within hours. Milk would sour, butter would melt, fruits and vegetables would ferment. The daily management of food, the constant struggle to keep it from spoiling before it could be eaten, was one of the most time-consuming and stressful aspects of summer life in pre-electric America. Ice was the only form of refrigeration available, and it was a luxury that many families could not afford. In northern states, ice was harvested from frozen lakes and rivers during the winter, cut into large blocks, and stored in insulated ice houses packed with sawdust or straw. This ice could last through the summer months if the ice house was well constructed, and families with access to an ice house or to an ice delivery service could keep a small amount of perishable food cool in an ice box, a forerunner of the modern refrigerator. The ice trade was one of the most remarkable industries in pre-electric America. By the mid-19th century, ice harvesting had become a major commercial enterprise, with companies cutting millions of tons of ice from New England lakes each winter and shipping it to cities throughout the country and even overseas. The ice trade employed thousands of workers and generated millions of dollars in revenue, all to provide a commodity, cold, that we now produce effortlessly with electric refrigerators and freezers. But ice was expensive, and for most rural Americans and many urban Americans, it was simply not available. These families relied on centuries-old food preservation techniques: salting, smoking, drying, pickling, fermenting, and canning. The annual cycle of food preservation, putting up preserves in the summer and fall for consumption during the winter and spring, was one of the most important and most labor-intensive activities in the pre-electric American household. Autumn was the season of frantic preparation. As the days shortened and the first frosts approached, families worked with urgent intensity to prepare for winter. Crops had to be harvested and stored. Meat had to be butchered, salted, and smoked. Vegetables had to be pickled or preserved in root cellars. Firewood had to be cut, split, and stacked. Homes had to be weatherproofed with whatever materials were available: rags stuffed into cracks, animal skins hung over windows, earth banked against foundations to provide insulation. The emotional quality of autumn in pre-electric America was very different from our modern experience of the season. Today, we enjoy autumn for its beauty, its pleasant temperatures, and its association with holidays and traditions. For pre-electric Americans, autumn was beautiful too, but it was also the beginning of a long, anxious descent into the darkness and cold of winter. The shortening days were a visible reminder that the period of maximum darkness was approaching, and the falling temperatures signaled the beginning of months of hardship, confinement, and deprivation. Winter was the most challenging season, and its challenges were more severe and more relentless than modern Americans can easily imagine. The combination of extreme cold, limited food variety, and the crushing darkness of the shortest days created conditions that tested the physical and psychological endurance of entire communities. Cold was the most immediate and most dangerous challenge. Without central heating, without electric space heaters, without heated blankets, Americans confronted the cold with only fireplaces, wood stoves, and layers of clothing and bedding. And even with these defenses, the cold was penetrating and inescapable. A fireplace, which was the primary heating system in most American homes through the 18th century, was a spectacularly inefficient heat source. The vast majority of the heat produced by a fireplace went straight up the chimney, and the rest heated only the area immediately in front of the hearth. The far corners of a room could be frigid even while the area near the fire was tolerably warm. Walking from the fireplace to a window was like walking from one climate zone to another. In bedrooms, which typically had no heat source at all, temperatures could drop below freezing on cold nights. Water in bedside pitchers would freeze solid. Chamber pots, which were used because going to an outdoor privy in the middle of a winter night was genuinely dangerous, would develop a skin of ice on their contents. Breath would form visible clouds in the bedroom air. Families coped with bedroom cold through sheer volume of bedding. Feather beds, heavy quilts, blankets, and coverlets were piled high on beds. Bed warmers, which were long-handled metal pans filled with hot coals from the fireplace, were run between the sheets before bedtime to take the worst of the chill off. Hot stones or bricks, heated in the fireplace and wrapped in cloth, were placed at the foot of the bed as personal heat sources. And most critically, families shared beds not for reasons of intimacy, but for the simple practical reason that body heat was the most reliable heat source available. The practice of bed sharing was universal in pre-electric America. Children shared beds with siblings, travelers at inns shared beds with strangers, apprentices shared beds with other apprentices, servants shared beds with other servants. The concept of having one's own bed, let alone one's own heated bedroom, was a luxury available to very few Americans before the 20th century. The modern American assumption that every person should have their own bed in their own room is a direct product of electrification, which made it possible to heat every room in a house to a comfortable temperature. The food of winter in pre-electric America was monotonous, limited, and often nutritionally inadequate. Without refrigeration and without the ability to transport fresh produce over long distances, there were no refrigerated rail cars before the development of ice-cooled and eventually electrically refrigerated cars. Americans in winter ate what they had preserved in the fall and what they could store in root cellars. The winter diet for most Americans consisted primarily of salted pork, dried beans, cornmeal, root vegetables like potatoes, turnips, and carrots, and preserved fruits and pickles. Fresh vegetables were essentially unavailable from November through April. Fresh fruit was a distant memory. The vitamin deficiencies that resulted from this restricted diet were real and consequential. Scurvy, which we associate with long-distance sailors, was not uncommon in rural American communities during long winters. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency and exacerbated by the limited winter sunlight, affected children. General malaise, fatigue, and susceptibility to illness were the predictable results of months of nutritionally inadequate food. Spring was the season of resurrection and relief. As the days lengthened and the temperature rose, the accumulated miseries of winter gradually receded. The first fresh greens of spring, dandelion greens, wild onions, watercress, were consumed with a desperate enthusiasm that reflected months of vitamin deprivation. The first warm days brought people outdoors with an almost manic energy, eager to feel sunlight and warmth after months of confinement. But spring was also a season of intense labor. Fields had to be plowed and planted. Fences damaged by winter weather had to be repaired. Livestock that had survived the winter had to be tended. The house had to be cleaned, repaired, and opened up after months of being sealed against the cold. Spring cleaning, which survives as a cultural tradition, was originally a practical necessity. After a winter of burning wood and tallow, every surface in the house was coated with a layer of soot, grease, and grime that required thorough cleaning. The seasonal cycle of pre-electric America was not just a physical reality, but a psychological one. The human mood fluctuated with the seasons in a way that modern Americans, insulated by electricity from the extremes of light and darkness, rarely experience. Winter depression, what we now call seasonal affective disorder, was not recognized as a medical condition, but its symptoms, lethargy, sadness, irritability, social withdrawal, were widely acknowledged in diaries and personal writings from the era. People spoke of winter blues and cabin fever with a familiarity that suggests these conditions were nearly universal in the pre-electric North. The coming of electric lighting and eventually electric heating would flatten this seasonal cycle dramatically. With electric lights, the shortening days of autumn no longer meant a descent into darkness. With electric heating, winter no longer meant months of shivering and confinement. With electric refrigeration, summer no longer meant a constant battle against food spoilage. Electricity did not eliminate the seasons, but it profoundly diminished their power over daily life. And in doing so, it fundamentally altered the American experience of time and nature. Perhaps no aspect of pre-electric American life is as foreign to modern experience as the sheer physical labor required to accomplish basic daily tasks. Virtually everything that we do today with the flip of a switch or the push of a button, washing clothes, cooking meals, pumping water, grinding grain, heating rooms, preserving food, required hours of hard, manual, physical labor in pre-electric America. Let us begin with water, because water was at the center of everything, and obtaining it was a daily ordeal. Unless a family was fortunate enough to live near a spring or stream, water had to be drawn from a well. Drawing water from a well was not a simple matter of turning a faucet. It involved lowering a bucket on a rope into a shaft that might be 20, 40, or 60 feet deep, waiting for it to fill, and then hauling it back up hand over hand or with a crank mechanism. A full bucket of water weighs approximately 40 pounds. A typical household needed dozens of buckets of water per day for cooking, drinking, cleaning, and livestock. The daily water haul could total hundreds of pounds of water carried from the well to the house, the barn, and the kitchen garden. This water had to be carried inside the house in buckets and poured into storage containers. There was no plumbing, no faucets, no running water of any kind in most American homes before electricity made pressurized water systems practical on a large scale. Every drop of water that entered the house was carried in by hand, and every drop of wastewater was carried out by hand. The lack of running water had cascading consequences that affected every aspect of daily life. Bathing, for example, was a major logistical undertaking rather than a casual daily ritual. To take a bath, you had to haul enough water from the well to fill a tub, heat the water on the stove or over the fire, carry the heated water to the tub, bathe, and then carry the dirty water back outside and dispose of it. The entire process could take an hour or more and consumed a significant amount of fuel for heating. Because bathing was so labor-intensive, Americans before electricity bathed far less frequently than we do today. A weekly bath was considered adequate for most people. Daily bathing was virtually unknown, except among the very wealthy who could afford servants to do the hauling and heating. The expression Saturday night bath was not a joke. It was a literal description of the bathing schedule for millions of Americans who bathed once a week, typically on Saturday night in preparation for church on Sunday morning. And when families did bathe, the entire family often used the same tub of water in a specific order determined by household hierarchy. The father bathed first in the clean hot water. The mother bathed second. Then the children, oldest to youngest. The youngest child bathed last, in water that was by then lukewarm at best and distinctly dirty. This practice gave rise to the expression, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," which was originally a literal warning rather than a metaphor. Laundry was perhaps the most hated household task in pre-electric America, and for good reason. Without washing machines, without dryers, without hot running water, without commercial laundry detergent, washing clothes was a brutal, day-long, physically exhausting ordeal that was universally regarded as the worst regular task in the household. The process began the day before actual washing day, which was traditionally Monday. On Sunday evening, clothes were sorted and the most heavily soiled items were put to soak in cold water. On Monday morning, water was hauled from the well and heated in large pots over the fire or on the stove. The clothes were then scrubbed by hand on a washboard, a corrugated metal or glass surface mounted in a wooden frame. Scrubbing clothes on a washboard was back-breaking work that left hands raw, cracked, and bleeding, especially in cold weather. After scrubbing, the clothes were boiled in a large pot or copper to kill bacteria and loosen remaining dirt. They were then wrung out by hand, a process that required significant upper body strength, and rinsed in clean water. Then they were wrung out again and hung on a clothesline to dry, or, in winter, hung inside the house on racks and lines where they would drip on the floors and take days to dry in the cold, damp air. The process took most of the day, from early morning to late afternoon, and it was performed every single week without fail. Laundry was so time-consuming and so physically demanding that middle-class families who could afford to hire any household help at all typically hired a laundress before they hired any other type of servant. Having someone else do the laundry was considered the single most valuable form of household assistance, and it was the first task that families outsourced when their income allowed it. Ironing, which followed laundering, was another physically demanding task performed with heavy irons heated on the stove. These were called sad irons, from an Old English word meaning solid, and they weighed between 5 and 9 pounds each. A homemaker typically kept 2 or 3 irons in rotation, heating one on the stove while using another to press clothes, and then swapping when the working iron cooled down. Ironing a family's weekly laundry could take several hours and was performed in front of a hot stove, making it particularly miserable in summer. Cooking in pre-electric America was another task that bore little resemblance to its modern equivalent. Without electric or gas stoves, without microwaves, without refrigerators, without food processors, without blenders, without any of the dozens of small electric appliances that populate a modern kitchen, cooking was a time-consuming, labor-intensive, and frequently dangerous activity. The primary cooking apparatus for most of American history was either an open hearth or a cast iron wood-burning stove. Cooking over an open hearth, which was the standard method through the 18th century and into the early 19th century, required the cook to work directly in front of a roaring fire, manipulating heavy iron pots and kettles that hung from cranes and trammels over the flames. The heat was intense, the risk of burns was constant, and the physical demands were significant, as iron cookware was extremely heavy. Cast iron wood-burning stoves, which became common in the mid-19th century, were a significant improvement over hearth cooking, but still required constant attention and considerable skill. The cook had to manage the fire inside the stove, adjusting the air supply through dampers and adding wood at regular intervals to maintain the desired temperature. There were no thermostatic controls, no temperature dials, no timers. The cook judged the oven temperature by holding her hand inside and counting the seconds before the heat became unbearable, or by placing a piece of white paper in the oven and watching how quickly it browned. Bread baking, which was a regular task in most American households because commercially baked bread was not widely available in rural areas, illustrates the complexity of pre-electric cooking. The yeast had to be cultivated and maintained, either from commercial sources or from wild yeast captured in a sourdough starter. The grain had to be ground into flour, either at home with a hand mill or at a community grist mill. The dough had to be mixed and kneaded by hand, a process that took 20 minutes or more of vigorous physical effort. The dough had to rise for hours, and the timing of the rising had to be coordinated with the heating of the oven, which itself took hours. A single batch of bread could consume an entire day from start to finish. The list of daily tasks in a pre-electric American household extended far beyond washing, cooking, and water hauling. Candles and soap had to be made. Butter had to be churned. Meat had to be butchered and preserved. Gardens had to be tended. Eggs had to be gathered. Cows had to be milked. Yarn had to be spun. Cloth had to be woven or purchased. Clothes had to be sewn by hand, since sewing machines were not available until the mid-19th century and were not powered by electricity until much later. The total labor burden of maintaining a pre-electric American household has been estimated at approximately 11 to 13 hours per day for the primary homemaker, who was almost always a woman. This was not occasional, seasonal labor. This was every day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, with no vacations, no weekends off, and no labor-saving appliances. The physical toll was enormous. Women in pre-electric America aged rapidly by modern standards, and the chronic pain, exhaustion, and repetitive strain injuries associated with constant manual labor were simply accepted as unavoidable facts of life. The introduction of electric appliances in the early 20th century would transform this situation so dramatically that it constituted nothing less than a revolution in daily life. The electric washing machine alone saved an estimated 7 to 8 hours of labor per week. The electric iron saved several more hours. The electric stove eliminated the need to manage a wood fire for cooking. The electric refrigerator eliminated the need for daily shopping and complex food preservation routines. The electric vacuum cleaner replaced the back-breaking task of taking rugs outside, hanging them on a line, and beating the dust out of them with a stick. Together, these appliances reduced the daily labor of household maintenance from 11 or 13 hours to perhaps 4 or 5 hours, freeing up a staggering amount of time and energy that could be devoted to other activities. Many historians have argued persuasively that the electric household appliances of the early 20th century did more to liberate American women than any political or social movement, because they freed women from a burden of physical labor that had consumed their lives for centuries. In pre-electric America, the speed of communication was limited by the speed of physical travel, and this single fact shaped the American experience of community, family, and nationhood in ways that are difficult to appreciate in our age of instant global communication. A letter sent from New York to San Francisco in 1860 took approximately 3 weeks to arrive by the fastest available means, which was the overland mail service. By sea, going around Cape Horn, a letter could take 2 to 3 months. Even communication between neighboring cities was slow by modern standards. A letter from Philadelphia to New York, a distance of approximately 90 miles, typically took 1 to 2 days. These delays meant that Americans experienced the world on a fundamentally different timescale than we do today. News of major events, battles, natural disasters, political decisions took days or weeks to reach most Americans. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865, the news did not reach some parts of the American West for weeks. Parts of the former Confederacy did not learn of the assassination for over a month. The lived experience of receiving this kind of devastating news weeks after the event, when the rest of the country had already mourned and moved on, is almost incomprehensible to us today. when news of a major event reaches every corner of the globe within minutes. The telegraph, invented in the 1840s, was the first technology to begin breaking the tyranny of distance over communication, and its impact was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, information could travel faster than a person could carry it. A message could be sent from New York to Boston in minutes rather than days. News of a battle could reach the capital before the smoke had cleared from the battlefield. But the telegraph, while revolutionary, was limited in important ways. It required trained operators to send and receive messages in Morse code. It was expensive to use and was primarily a tool for business and government rather than personal communication. And it required a physical infrastructure, telegraph lines strung on poles along roads and railways that was vulnerable to storms, vandalism, and the general wear and tear of the elements. The telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, represented the next great leap in communication technology, and it was initially powered by batteries rather than the electrical grid. Early telephone systems were crude, unreliable, and limited in range. The sound quality was poor, conversations were frequently interrupted, and the number of people who could be connected was small. But even these early, primitive telephones began to transform American life in profound ways. For the first time, it was possible to have a real-time conversation with someone who was not physically present. This seems like such a basic capability today that we take it entirely for granted. But for Americans who had grown up in a world where the only way to speak with someone was to be in the same room with them, the telephone was nothing short of miraculous. The telephone's impact on rural America, where it was initially adopted more slowly than in cities, was eventually even more transformative than its urban impact. Rural Americans who lived in conditions of profound isolation had been cut off from rapid communication with the outside world for their entire lives. A farm family living 10 miles from the nearest town might go weeks without seeing anyone outside their immediate family. News, gossip, medical advice, market prices for crops all came sporadically and unreliably through occasional trips to town or through neighbors who happened to pass by. The telephone changed all of that. A farm family with a telephone could call for a doctor in an emergency. They could check crop prices before deciding when to sell. They could stay in touch with family members who had moved away. They could participate in the social life of their community without making the long, time-consuming trip to town. But we are getting ahead of ourselves because the full electrification of the telephone system and its integration into the national electrical grid is part of the story of electrification itself. In the pre-electric era proper, the dominant experience of communication for most Americans was the handwritten letter carried by horse, stage, rail, or foot at a speed that made every piece of news old by the time it arrived and made every relationship subject to the anxiety of delayed response. The emotional consequences of slow communication were profound. Parents who sent children west on the frontier might wait months for a letter confirming that their child had arrived safely. Wives of soldiers waited weeks or months for news from the front, not knowing whether their husbands were alive or dead. Business partners in different cities could not coordinate in real time and had to make decisions based on information that was days or weeks out of date. Loneliness was a pervasive feature of pre-electric American life, particularly in rural areas. The diaries and letters of frontier women are filled with expressions of isolation so intense that they read like cries for help. Women who had moved from eastern cities to western homesteads wrote of going weeks without seeing another woman, of talking to their chickens and cows for companionship, of weeping at the sight of a distant rider because it meant the possibility of human contact. The isolation was not just emotional but intellectual. Without radio, without television, without the internet, and with limited access to books and newspapers, most Americans had a remarkably narrow window on the world beyond their immediate community. A farmer in rural Nebraska in 1880 might know intimate details about the personalities, habits, and histories of every family within a 10-mile radius, but have only the vaguest awareness of national politics, world events, or cultural developments in distant cities. Books were precious and scarce. Public libraries did not exist in most American communities until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and even then, they were primarily urban institutions. A farm family might own a handful of books, typically a Bible, an almanac, and perhaps a few volumes of fiction or history acquired over years. These books were read and reread until they were memorized, and the arrival of a new book in the household was an event of genuine excitement. Newspapers were more widely available than books, but were still irregular and expensive for many Americans. A rural family might receive a weekly newspaper by mail, and that single newspaper would be read from front to back, including every advertisement, by every literate member of the household. The newspaper was then passed to neighbors, who read it in turn so that a single copy might be read by a dozen or more people before it was finally used for some practical purpose like starting a fire or wrapping food. The intellectual and cultural life of pre-electric America was shaped by this scarcity of information and entertainment in ways that are both charming and limiting. On the positive side, pre-electric Americans developed rich traditions of oral storytelling, singing, and conversation that served as their primary forms of entertainment. Families gathered around the fire in the evening and told stories, sang songs, recited poetry, and played word games. These communal activities built strong family bonds and preserved cultural traditions in ways that the passive consumption of electronic media does not. On the negative side, the limited availability of information meant that ignorance, superstition, and misinformation were widespread. Medical quackery flourished because most people had no access to reliable medical information. Political manipulation was easier because voters had limited ability to independently verify the claims of politicians. Prejudice and intolerance were harder to combat because most people had little exposure to people and cultures different from their own. The entertainment options available in pre-electric America were, by modern standards, extremely limited. There were no movies, no television, no radio, no recorded music, no video games, no streaming services, no social media. Entertainment was either self-generated, such as singing, dancing, playing musical instruments, reading and playing games, or it was live and communal, such as theatrical performances, lectures, concerts, and community gatherings. Theatrical performances and lectures were popular forms of entertainment in towns and cities, but they were available only sporadically in rural areas. The Chautauqua movement, which began in 1874, attempted to bring lectures, concerts, and educational programs to rural communities through traveling tent shows, and it became enormously popular precisely because it filled a desperate hunger for intellectual stimulation and entertainment that the isolation of rural life had created. Music was perhaps the most important form of entertainment in pre-electric America, and it was fundamentally different from our modern experience of music. All music was live. There was no way to record or reproduce sound before Thomas Edison invented the phonograph in 1877. And even after the phonograph became available, it was expensive and the quality of early recordings was poor. For most Americans, music meant someone in the room playing a fiddle, a guitar, a banjo, a piano, or a harmonica, and everyone else singing along. This meant that musical skill was far more common and far more valued than it is today. In a world without recorded music, someone who could play an instrument or sing well was a genuinely valuable community member because they were the only source of music available. Families encouraged musical education not just as a cultural refinement, but as a practical social skill. A young person who could play the fiddle or the piano was always welcome at social gatherings, and musical ability was considered an important asset in attracting a spouse. The relationship between pre-electric America and the human body was radically different from our modern experience. And understanding this relationship is essential to understanding what daily life was actually like before electricity. Begin with the most basic physical fact. In pre-electric America, the human body was the primary machine. Almost all productive work was accomplished through human and animal muscle power. There were water-powered mills and wind-powered pumps, but these were stationary installations that could only operate where water or wind was available. For the vast majority of tasks, the energy source was human hands, arms, legs, and backs. This meant that physical strength and endurance were not optional attributes. They were essential survival skills. Men who could not perform heavy manual labor, plowing, chopping, lifting, hauling, were severely handicapped in an economy that was built on physical work. Women who could not endure the physical demands of household labor, the washing, the hauling, the kneading, the churning, faced equally serious challenges. Physical disability, which in our modern economy can be accommodated through technology and accommodation, was often a catastrophic condition in pre-electric America because there was simply no way to replace human muscle power with mechanical alternatives. Also functioned differently in pre-electric America because of the dramatically different lifestyle. Americans before electricity walked vastly more than modern Americans. Without automobiles, without electric streetcars, without escalators and elevators, every trip, no matter how short, was made on foot or on horseback. A farmer might walk 5 to 10 miles in the course of a normal working day, just moving between the house, the barn, the fields, and the well. Urban Americans walked to work, to church, to market, and to social engagements. A typical city dweller in the 19th century might walk 3 to 5 miles daily. This constant physical activity, combined with a diet that was, despite its limitations, lower in processed sugar, refined flour, and chemical additives than the modern American diet, meant that obesity was relatively rare in pre-electric America. The abundant, calorie-dense, readily available food supply that electricity-dependent technologies like refrigeration, food processing, and mechanized agriculture would eventually create did not yet exist. People ate what was available, and what was available was often limited. But the health advantages of a physically active, low-calorie lifestyle were overwhelmed by the health disadvantages of a world without modern medicine, without sanitation infrastructure, and without the diagnostic and treatment technologies that electricity would eventually make possible. Life expectancy in pre-electric America was shockingly low by modern standards. In 1850, the average life expectancy at birth in the United States was approximately 38 years. This number is somewhat misleading because it is heavily influenced by extremely high infant and child mortality. But even adjusted for infant mortality, pre-electric Americans died much younger than modern Americans. A person who survived childhood could expect to live into their 50s or 60s, but reaching 70 was uncommon and reaching 80 was rare. The causes of death tell the story. Infectious diseases, particularly tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and malaria, were the leading killers. These diseases thrived in the conditions of pre-electric America: contaminated water supplies, inadequate sanitation, crowded living conditions, poor nutrition, and limited medical knowledge. Contaminated water was perhaps the deadliest feature of pre-electric American life. Without electric pumps to create pressurized water systems, without electric-powered water treatment plants, and without the scientific understanding of waterborne disease that would eventually develop, Americans routinely drank water that was contaminated with human and animal waste. Wells were often located too close to privies and barns, and the groundwater they tapped was frequently contaminated with bacteria that caused deadly diarrheal diseases. Cholera epidemics swept through American cities repeatedly in the 19th century, killing thousands in each outbreak. The 1849 cholera epidemic killed approximately 5,000 people in New York City alone. The disease was spread primarily through contaminated water, but this was not understood at the time, and the medical establishment offered remedies that ranged from useless to actively harmful. Medical care in pre-electric America was, by modern standards, primitive and often dangerous. Doctors had no X-rays, no MRI machines, no CAT scans, no electronic monitoring equipment, none of the diagnostic technologies that modern medicine depends on, and that are entirely dependent on electricity. Diagnosis was based primarily on the patient's description of symptoms, the doctor's visual observation, and physical examination. Surgery was performed without electric lighting, which meant that operations were scheduled during daylight hours to ensure adequate illumination, or were performed by the light of candles and oil lamps in conditions that would horrify modern surgeons. The lack of electric-powered sterilization equipment meant that instruments were inadequately cleaned, and the resulting infections killed a significant percentage of surgical patients. Anesthesia was available from the 1840s onward in the form of ether and chloroform. But the precise administration of these agents was difficult without the monitoring equipment that electricity would eventually make possible. Dentistry was particularly brutal. Without electric drills, dental work was performed with hand-powered tools that were slow, imprecise, and agonizing. Most people with serious dental problems simply had the offending teeth pulled, often without adequate anesthesia, and the loss of teeth was so common that dentures were a routine item of personal equipment. George Washington's famous dentures, which were made not of wood, as legend has it, but of hippopotamus ivory, human teeth, and metal, were merely the most famous example of a universally experienced problem. Eye care was similarly limited. Without electrically powered equipment for grinding lenses, eye examinations, and surgical procedures, vision problems were often untreatable or were treated inadequately. Eyeglasses were available but were expensive and imprecise, and many people with correctable vision problems simply lived with poor eyesight because they could not afford or could not access appropriate corrective lenses. The medical consequences of pre-electric life extended beyond the absence of electric-powered medical equipment. The conditions of daily life themselves generated health problems that modern Americans rarely experience. The constant inhalation of smoke from fireplaces, candles, oil lamps, and wood stoves caused chronic respiratory problems. The physical demands of manual labor caused musculoskeletal injuries and chronic pain. The poor nutrition, especially during winter, compromised immune function and made people more susceptible to infectious disease. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Without electric-powered monitoring equipment, without electric lighting for emergency procedures, and without the ability to quickly summon help by telephone, childbirth in pre-electric America was a life-threatening event. The maternal mortality rate in the 19th century was approximately 1 in 100 births, meaning that a woman who had 7 or 8 children, which was the average family size for much of the century, faced a cumulative risk of dying in childbirth of approximately 7 to 8%. This is an astonishingly high number, and it meant that every family knew women who had died in childbirth. Every community had fresh graves of young mothers. Infant mortality was even more devastating. Approximately 1 in 5 babies born in the mid-19th century died before reaching their first birthday. 1 in 3 did not survive to age 5. These numbers are so high that they are almost incomprehensible to modern Americans, for whom infant death is rare and devastating. For pre-electric Americans, the death of a child was a common, expected, and endlessly repeated tragedy. The emotional impact of this constant exposure to death and loss is one of the most profound differences between pre-electric and modern American life. Death was not a distant, sanitized event that happened in hospitals and funeral homes. It happened in the home, in the presence of family, often in the same bed where the sick person had slept their entire life. Bodies were prepared for burial by family members, not by professional morticians. Wakes were held in the home, with the body lying in the parlor, a room that was specifically designed for this purpose and that we have since renamed the living room in a telling act of linguistic denial. Grief was constant and pervasive. The diaries of pre-electric Americans are saturated with loss. The loss of children, spouses, parents, siblings, and friends to diseases and accidents that modern medicine would have easily treated. The emotional landscape of pre-electric America was shaped by an intimacy with death that modern Americans have almost entirely lost. And this intimacy influenced everything from religious faith to child-rearing practices to the way people thought about the future. The social world of pre-electric America was structured by constraints that have largely vanished. And understanding these constraints is essential to understanding the texture of daily life. The most fundamental social constraint was physical proximity. In a world without telephones, without automobiles, without electric streetcars, your social world was limited to the people you could physically reach on foot or on horseback. For most Americans, this meant a radius of 5 to 10 miles. Your friends, your neighbors, your romantic prospects, your business partners, your enemies, all came from this limited geographic area. The idea of having a friend or a romantic partner in a distant city was essentially impossible for ordinary Americans. This geographic limitation had profound consequences for social life. Communities were tight-knit to a degree that modern Americans rarely experience. Everyone knew everyone else. Everyone knew everyone else's business, their income, their habits, their family history, their strengths and weaknesses. Privacy in the modern sense barely existed. Your neighbors knew when you fought with your spouse, when your cow was sick, when you had a bad harvest, when you received a letter, and when your daughter was courting a young man from the next farm. This lack of privacy was both a blessing and a burden. On the positive side, it created a support network that was extraordinarily effective. When a family was in trouble, the community knew and could respond. When a barn burned down, the neighbors would organize a barn raising. When a mother was sick, neighboring women would come to cook, clean, and care for the children. When a farmer was injured during harvest, his neighbors would bring in his crops. The mutual aid networks of pre-electric American communities were remarkably robust because there was no alternative. Without government safety nets, without insurance companies, without any of the institutional support systems that modern Americans rely on, the community was the safety net. On the negative side, the intense social scrutiny of small communities could be suffocating. Nonconformity of any kind in behavior, belief, or lifestyle was noticed, discussed, and often punished through social ostracism. People who violated community norms were shunned, gossiped about, and sometimes driven out of the community entirely. The pressure to conform was immense, and the psychological toll of living under constant observation and judgment was significant. Social gatherings in pre-electric America served a different function than they do today, because they were often the only opportunity for social interaction outside the immediate family. Church services, which were held on Sunday mornings, were as much social events as religious ones. They provided a regular, predictable opportunity for the community to gather, exchange news, conduct business, and reinforce social bonds. The importance of church attendance in pre-electric America cannot be understood solely in terms of religious devotion. It was the primary social institution in most communities, the only regular gathering of the entire community. And it served functions that we now spread across dozens of different institutions, from schools and libraries to community centers and social media platforms. Other social gatherings were organized around work. Quilting bees, corn huskings, barn raisings, and apple parings were events that combined necessary labor with social interaction. A quilting bee, for example, brought together the women of a community to work collectively on a quilt. But the quilting was accompanied by conversation, gossip, singing, and the sharing of food. A corn husking brought together men and boys to strip the husks from harvested corn. But it was also an occasion for competition, storytelling, and often drinking. These work and socializing events were essential to the mental health of pre-electric Americans because they broke the isolation of daily life and provided the human contact that people needed to maintain their psychological well-being. The modern concept of socializing as a leisure activity, separate from work, is largely a product of electrification, which created enough leisure time and enough lighting to allow social interaction to occur independently of productive labor. Courtship and marriage in pre-electric America were shaped by the same constraints of proximity and community that governed all social life. Young people met potential spouses at church, at community gatherings, or through introductions by family and neighbors. The pool of potential partners was small, often limited to a few dozen eligible individuals within a reasonable geographic radius. Long-distance courtship was difficult because of the slow pace of communication and the expense and difficulty of travel. The courtship process itself was conducted under the watchful eyes of the community, with limited privacy and strict social expectations. Young couples were rarely left alone together before marriage, and physical intimacy before marriage was officially forbidden, though it certainly occurred. The practice of bundling, in which a courting couple was allowed to share a bed while fully clothed and sometimes separated by a board or a bundling sack, was a uniquely pre-electric American solution to the problem of courtship in a world where homes were small, privacy was limited, and the only warm room in the house was the one where the rest of the family was gathered. Marriage in pre-electric America was as much an economic partnership as a romantic one. The division of labor within the household was strict and well defined, with men responsible for outdoor and agricultural work, and women responsible for indoor and domestic work. Both contributions were essential, and neither spouse could effectively manage alone. A widower with young children was in desperate need of a wife to manage the household, and a widow without means of support was equally in need of a husband. The economic imperative behind marriage meant that remarriage after the death of a spouse was rapid and common, often occurring within months rather than years. Children in pre-electric America occupied a very different social position than children do today. They were expected to contribute to the household labor force from an early age. By age 5 or 6, children were given simple tasks such as gathering eggs, feeding chickens, carrying water, and minding younger siblings. By age 10 or 12, children were performing significant agricultural and domestic work, and by their mid-teens, they were doing work that was essentially indistinguishable from adult labor. Formal education was limited and sporadic for most American children before the late 19th century. Rural schools, when they existed, were typically one-room buildings where a single teacher instructed children of all ages in basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. The school year was short, often only a few months, because children were needed for farm labor during the planting and harvesting seasons. And the quality of instruction was uneven because teachers were often young, poorly trained, and poorly paid. The limited education available in pre-electric America meant that literacy rates, while higher in America than in most other countries, were still far from universal. Illiteracy was common in rural areas and among the poor, and even among the literate, the level of education was typically much lower than modern standards. A person who could read a newspaper, write a simple letter, and perform basic arithmetic was considered well educated by the standards of much of pre-electric America. The story of how electricity came to America is one of the most dramatic and consequential stories in all of human history, and it is worth telling in some detail because the transformation it brought was so complete that we cannot fully appreciate what came before without understanding how it ended. The story begins in many tellings with Thomas Edison, but the truth is more complex and more interesting than the simple narrative of a lone genius inventing the light bulb. The development of electric lighting was the product of decades of experimentation by dozens of inventors in multiple countries, and Edison's contribution, while enormous, was part of a much larger tapestry of innovation. The basic science of electricity had been developing since the 18th century, with Benjamin Franklin's famous kite experiment in 1752 establishing that lightning was an electrical phenomenon. Through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, scientists in Europe and America steadily advanced the understanding of electrical principles, developing batteries, generators, and the theoretical framework that would eventually make practical electric power possible. The first practical electric lights were arc lights, which produced illumination by creating a continuous spark between two carbon electrodes. Arc lights were incredibly bright, far brighter than any previous artificial light source, but they were also harsh, noisy, and difficult to control. They were suitable for lighting large outdoor spaces, such as streets and plazas, but they were entirely impractical for home use. The idea of putting an arc light in your living room would have been like putting a searchlight in your bedroom, impossibly bright, intensely hot, and accompanied by a constant buzzing and crackling sound. Arc lights were first used for public illumination in the late 1870s, and their impact was dramatic. Cities that installed arc streetlights experienced an immediate transformation of nighttime life. Streets that had been dark, dangerous, and largely deserted after sunset were suddenly bathed in brilliant white light. Pedestrians could walk safely after dark. Businesses could stay open later. Social life shifted to later hours because people were no longer forced indoors by darkness. But the real revolution, the one that would transform not just public spaces, but private homes, came with the development of the incandescent light bulb. The idea of producing light by heating a filament inside a glass bulb until it glowed was not new. Dozens of inventors had experimented with incandescent lights throughout the 19th century. The problem was finding a filament material that would glow brightly without burning out almost immediately, and finding a way to remove the oxygen from inside the bulb so that the filament would not combust. Thomas Edison was not the first person to create an incandescent light bulb. Several other inventors, including Humphrey Davy, Warren de la Rue, James Bowman Lindsay, and most notably Joseph Swan in England, had created working incandescent lights before Edison. What Edison did that was genuinely revolutionary was not merely inventing a light bulb, but creating an entire system for generating, distributing, and using electric power. He designed generators, wiring, switches, meters, fuses, and sockets. He designed the entire infrastructure that would be needed to deliver electricity from a central generating station to individual homes and businesses. He thought not just about the light bulb, but about the entire ecosystem that the light bulb would need to function. Edison's Pearl Street Station in Lower Manhattan, which began operation on September 4, 1882, was the first commercial central power station in America. It initially served about 85 customers in a 1 square mile area of Lower Manhattan, providing electric lighting to offices, businesses, and a few homes. The light it produced was steady, clean, safe, and controllable. There was no smoke, no soot, no smell, no fire danger, and no need for constant trimming of wicks or management of fuel. You flipped a switch and the light came on. You flipped it again and the light went off. It was, by the standards of the time, almost magical. The reaction of people who experienced electric light for the first time is one of the most touching aspects of the electrification story. Diaries and newspapers from the 1880s and 1890s record the astonishment, the delight, and sometimes the fear that people felt when they first saw electric lights. Many people were afraid to turn them on and off, worried that they would receive a shock or start a fire. Some people tried to light electric bulbs with a match, not understanding that electricity, not fire, was the power source. Others were simply overwhelmed by the brightness, having spent their entire lives in rooms lit by candles and oil lamps that produced a fraction of the light that a single electric bulb could provide. One frequently reported reaction was tears. People wept when they first saw electric light in their homes. They wept at the brightness, at the steadiness, at the sheer beauty of a room fully illuminated for the first time. Women who had spent decades sewing and cooking and reading by the dim, flickering light of candles and oil lamps broke down at the sight of their homes bathed in clear, bright, steady light. It was as if they were seeing their own homes for the first time. The spread of electric lighting through American cities was rapid but uneven. Wealthy neighborhoods and commercial districts were electrified first, followed by middle-class residential areas and eventually working-class neighborhoods. The pattern of electrification traced the contours of American wealth and power, with the rich getting light first and the poor waiting years or even decades. The impact of electric lighting on city life was transformative in almost every respect. Businesses could stay open after dark, extending the commercial day and creating the concept of nightlife that did not really exist before electric lighting. Restaurants, theaters, shops, and entertainment venues could operate in the evening hours, creating a vibrant nighttime economy that had been impossible when the only illumination came from gas lamps and candles. Streets became safer, or at least were perceived as safer, when electric streetlights replaced the dim gas lamps that had provided inadequate illumination. The psychological impact of well-lit streets was significant. People felt more comfortable walking at night, more willing to go out for social and recreational purposes, and more confident in the safety of their neighborhoods. The electrification of homes changed the way Americans used their living spaces. Rooms that had previously been dark and uninviting in the evening were now fully illuminated and usable. The kitchen could be used for cooking and socializing after dark. Children could do homework in the evening. Adults could read, write, and pursue hobbies with adequate light. The home ceased to be a place of darkness and retreat and became a place of light and activity throughout the waking hours. But while cities were being transformed by electric light, rural America remained in the dark. And this is one of the most important and least appreciated chapters in the story of American electrification. The electrification of rural America was one of the great dramas of the 20th century, and it is a story of politics, economics, determination, and the profound gap between urban and rural life that electricity both exposed and eventually helped to close. The problem was simple and stark. Electricity was generated at power plants and distributed through wires to homes and businesses. Building the infrastructure to distribute electricity, the poles, the wires, the transformers, the substations, was expensive. In cities where homes and businesses were densely clustered, the cost per customer was manageable because a single mile of wire could serve dozens or even hundreds of customers. But in rural areas, where farms were spread out over vast distances, a single mile of wire might serve only one or two customers. The cost per customer in rural areas was many times higher than in urban areas, and private electric utility companies, which were profit-driven enterprises, saw no financial incentive to extend their lines into the countryside. The result was a staggering disparity. By 1930, nearly 90% of urban Americans had electric service, but only about 10% of rural Americans did. This means that in 1930, almost half a century after Edison's Pearl Street station began operation, the vast majority of American farm families were still living without electricity. They were still using kerosene lamps for light, wood stoves for cooking and heating, hand pumps for water, and manual labor for every household task. The gap between electrified urban America and unelectrified rural America was not just a matter of convenience, it was a chasm that affected every aspect of life. Urban Americans had electric lights, electric appliances, electric-powered communication, electric entertainment in the form of radio and eventually television. Rural Americans had none of these things. The two populations were living in what amounted to different centuries, and the difference was growing wider every year as new electric-powered technologies continued to transform urban life, while rural life remained essentially unchanged. The human cost of this disparity was enormous and is powerfully documented in the letters and testimonies of rural Americans from this period. Farm women, in particular, wrote with desperate eloquence about the crushing burden of life without electricity. They wrote about washing clothes by hand while their urban cousins had electric washing machines. They wrote about ironing with heavy, sad irons while city women used electric irons. They wrote about the danger of kerosene lamps, about the darkness, about the isolation, about the feeling of being left behind by a country that was racing into a bright electric future while they remained trapped in the past. One famous letter written by a Texas farm woman to her congressman in the 1930s captures the frustration and despair with heartbreaking clarity. She wrote about rising before dawn to start the wood stove, about hauling water from the well in the bitter cold, about washing clothes on a washboard until her hands bled, about the kerosene lamp that had nearly burned the house down, about the isolation of long winter evenings with no radio, no telephone, and no light bright enough to read by. She concluded by asking a question that encapsulated the entire rural electrification debate. Why should I live like this when people in the cities don't have to? The answer to that question came in the form of the Rural Electrification Administration, or REA, established by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1935 as part of the New Deal. The REA was created specifically to bring electricity to rural America, and it did so through a combination of government loans, technical assistance, and the organization of rural electric cooperatives, non-profit organizations owned by the rural customers themselves. The REA's impact was nothing short of revolutionary. In the decade following its creation, the percentage of American farms with electricity jumped from about 11% to approximately 90%. Millions of farm families experienced the transformation from kerosene to electric light, from hand-pumped to running water, from manual to electric-powered household labor in a compressed period that made the change even more dramatic and emotionally overwhelming than it had been for urban Americans who had experienced the transition more gradually. The stories of rural electrification are among the most moving in American history. There are accounts of families gathered around their kitchen table on the evening when the power was first connected, waiting in the kerosene lamp-lit room for the moment when someone would flip the switch and the electric light would come on for the first time. There are accounts of women who wept uncontrollably when they first used an electric washing machine, overwhelmed by the sudden liberation from the most hated task in the household. There are accounts of children seeing their homes fully illuminated for the first time and being astonished at details, the colors of wallpaper, the patterns on dishes, the faces of family members that they had never truly seen before because they had only ever been visible in the dim glow of kerosene light. One widely reported story tells of a farm woman in rural Tennessee who, on the day electricity came to her community, went around her house turning on every light and then walked outside to see her home blazing with light for the first time. She stood in the yard and stared at her house and cried. When asked why she was crying, she said, "Because I didn't know I lived in such a beautiful house." The coming of electricity to rural America was not just a technological change, it was a social revolution. It brought radio, which connected isolated farm families to the wider world, and brought music, news, entertainment, and educational programming into homes that had been cut off from all of these things. It brought electric-powered water pumps, which eliminated the back-breaking daily labor of hauling water from wells. It brought refrigeration, which transformed food storage and diet. It brought electric lighting, which extended the productive day, made homes safer, and improved the quality of life in ways both large and small. The transformation was so complete and so rapid that within a generation, the memory of pre-electric life began to fade. Children who had grown up with kerosene lamps and washboards and wood stoves became adults who took electric light, washing machines, and electric stoves entirely for granted. Their children, the baby boomers, grew up in a fully electrified world and had no personal experience of the pre-electric era at all. And their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, today's Americans, are so far removed from the pre-electric world that it might as well be another planet. As you lie here in the comfortable darkness of your bedroom, perhaps with the soft glow of a night light, or the faint hum of an air conditioner, or the distant sound of a refrigerator cycling on and off, it is worth reflecting on just how profoundly electricity has changed the world you live in, and how utterly different your life is from the lives of Americans who lived just a few generations ago. You woke up this morning in a warm or cool room, depending on the season, because electric heating or air conditioning maintained a comfortable temperature throughout the night. You stumbled to a bathroom where electric lights illuminated your way, where running water, delivered by electric pumps, flowed from faucets, and where a hot shower, heated by an electric or gas water heater, was available at the turn of a handle. You ate breakfast that came from an electric refrigerator, was prepared on an electric or gas stove, and might have been supplemented by a microwave, a toaster, or a coffee maker, all powered by electricity. You communicated with friends, family, and colleagues through devices, smartphones, computers, tablets that are entirely dependent on electricity and that give you instant access to virtually all of the information that humanity has ever produced. You traveled in a vehicle that relies on electricity for its ignition system, its lighting, its instruments, and increasingly for its primary propulsion. You worked in a building that is heated, cooled, lit, and connected to the outside world entirely through electrical systems. Every single one of these things, every comfort, every convenience, every connection, every piece of information would have been impossible, unimaginable to an American living before electricity. The world you inhabit is so completely dependent on electricity that removing it would not merely cause inconvenience. It would cause the collapse of virtually every system that sustains modern American life. And yet the world that existed before electricity was not a world of misery and deprivation, or at least it was not only that. It was a world that had its own rhythms, its own beauties, and its own strengths, many of which we have lost in the electrified world. The pre-electric night sky, for example, was a source of wonder and beauty that most modern Americans have never experienced. Light pollution from electric lights has made the Milky Way invisible from most of the United States. The stars that once guided navigators, inspired poets, and filled every American with awe on every clear night are now hidden behind a perpetual electric glow. Astronomers estimate that 80% of Americans living today have never seen the Milky Way with their naked eyes. The pre-electric relationship with nature was deeper, more intimate, and more respectful than our modern relationship, born of necessity rather than choice. When your survival depended on the weather, the seasons, the soil, and the behavior of animals, you paid attention to the natural world in a way that no amount of nature documentaries and environmental activism can replicate. Pre-electric Americans were keen observers of weather patterns, animal behavior, plant cycles, and celestial movements because their lives depended on this knowledge. The pre-electric social world, for all its limitations, was characterized by a depth of community connection that many modern Americans long for. When your social world was limited to the people within walking distance, you invested deeply in those relationships. Neighbors were not merely people who happened to live nearby. They were essential partners in survival, people whose help you could not afford to lose and whose well-being was directly connected to your own. For all the hardships it endured, was bound together by shared labor and mutual dependence in a way that modern families often are not. When every member of the household, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent, had essential tasks to perform, family unity was not an abstract ideal, it was a practical necessity. The decline of shared household labor, which is largely a consequence of electric appliances reducing the total labor needed to maintain a home, has contributed to the loosening of family bonds that many Americans now lament. And the pre-electric experience of silence, true silence, the kind of silence that modern Americans almost never experience because of the constant background hum of electrical devices, was something that shaped the inner life of Americans in ways that we can barely imagine. Without the noise of televisions, radios, computers, air conditioners, refrigerators, and all the other buzzing, humming, chirping machines that fill modern life, pre-electric Americans lived in a sound environment that was dominated by natural sounds: wind, rain, birdsong, animal calls, and the voices of the people around them. This silence, or rather this natural soundscape, was the backdrop against which all of life unfolded, and its loss is one of the most subtle but most profound consequences of electrification. There are still places in America where echoes of the pre-electric world can be heard, and visiting these places, or even just learning about them, can help us understand what was lost and what was gained in the Great Transformation. The Amish communities of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and other states are the most visible and most famous example of Americans who have chosen to live without many of the conveniences of electrification. While the Amish relationship with technology is more nuanced than most people realize, and different Amish communities have different standards about what technologies are acceptable, many Amish families still live without connection to the electrical grid. They use kerosene lamps, wood stoves, hand-powered tools, and horse-drawn transportation. Their daily lives bear a closer resemblance to the pre-electric world than to the modern American mainstream. Visitors to Amish communities often report being struck by the quality of silence, by the darkness of the nights, by the rhythm of a day structured around sunlight rather than the clock, and by the intensity of social connection within the community. These are not romanticized observations by naive tourists. They are authentic experiences of a way of life that was universal in America just a few generations ago, and that has been preserved deliberately and at considerable sacrifice by communities that believe the benefits of that way of life outweigh the conveniences they have given up. There are also moments in modern American life when the pre-electric world briefly reasserts itself, most dramatically during power outages. When a storm or an equipment failure knocks out the electrical grid, Americans get a sudden, involuntary glimpse of what life was like before electricity, and the experience is almost universally unpleasant and disorienting. Within minutes of a power outage, the first thing people notice is the darkness. Even during the day, interior rooms without windows become unusably dark. At night, the darkness is total. Flashlights and candles are pressed into service, and their inadequacy becomes immediately apparent. A flashlight provides a narrow beam that illuminates only what it is pointed at, leaving everything else in darkness. A candle provides a small, flickering circle of light that barely extends beyond arm's reach. Within hours, the second thing people notice is the silence, or rather, the absence of the constant background noise that they had never consciously registered. The refrigerator stops humming. The air conditioner stops blowing. The clock stops ticking. The television, the computer, the charger, the router all fall silent. The resulting quiet is profound and, for many people, deeply unsettling. Within a day, the practical consequences of electricity's absence become severe. Refrigerated food begins to spoil. Communication becomes difficult as phone batteries die and cell towers lose their backup power. Water stops flowing if the municipal system relies on electric pumps. Heat or cooling disappears. The carefully constructed cocoon of comfort that electricity provides begins to collapse, and the raw, inconvenient, challenging reality of unelectrified life begins to assert itself. These moments of involuntary de-electrification are instructive because they remind us of something we tend to forget, that our modern lifestyle is not the natural human condition. It is a historically recent construction built on a foundation of electrical infrastructure that is less than a century and a half old. For the vast majority of human history, and for the vast majority of American history, people lived without electricity, and they managed, survived, loved, created, and built a civilization that would eventually produce the technology that transformed everything. Sometimes it is illuminating to imagine what a pre-electric American transported through time to the present day would think of our electrified world. The exercise is not merely whimsical. It helps us see our own world with fresh eyes and appreciate things that we normally take entirely for granted. Imagine a farm woman from 1880 walking into a modern American kitchen. She would be astonished by the refrigerator, a box that keeps food cold indefinitely without ice. She would be amazed by the electric stove, which produces heat instantly, without fire, without smoke, and without the need to chop and carry wood. She would be baffled by the microwave, which heats food in seconds through some invisible force. She would be delighted by the faucet, which provides unlimited clean water, hot or cold, at the turn of a handle. But she would also, I think, be saddened by some of what she saw. She might notice that the kitchen, despite all its marvels, is often occupied by only one person, because the electric appliances have eliminated the need for the communal labor that once brought families together around the tasks of food preparation. She might notice that the family gathers not around the hearth, but around the television, each person absorbed in a screen rather than engaged in conversation. She might notice that the children, rather than working alongside their parents and learning the skills of self-sufficiency, are in separate rooms staring at their own screens. She would almost certainly be overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of our world. The amount of food in a single modern American supermarket would be staggering to someone from 1880. Not just the quantity, but the variety. Fresh fruits and vegetables from every continent, available year-round, regardless of season. Meat in quantities and varieties that would have seemed like a king's feast. Prepared foods that require no cooking at all. The concept of food waste, of throwing away edible food because we have more than we can eat. would be not just surprising but morally incomprehensible to someone who had spent every autumn anxiously calculating whether the family's preserved food would last until spring. She would be fascinated and possibly frightened by the speed of modern life. The pace at which modern Americans move, communicate, and process information would seem almost violently fast to someone accustomed to a life structured around the slow rhythms of sunlight, seasons, and horse-drawn transportation. The constant stimulation of screens, notifications, and media would be overwhelming. The expectation that one should be available for communication at any hour of the day or night would seem bizarre and intrusive. And she would, I believe, be struck by the paradox at the heart of our electrified world, that despite all our convenience, all our abundance, all our connection, all our entertainment, modern Americans do not seem noticeably happier than people were in her time. We have conquered darkness, cold, hunger, isolation, and physical drudgery to a degree that would have seemed miraculous to any previous generation, and yet we are plagued by anxiety, depression, loneliness, and a pervasive sense that something essential is missing from our lives. This is not to romanticize the pre-electric past or to suggest that we should return to it. The pre-electric world was hard, often cruel, and filled with suffering that no sane person would willingly choose. The infant who died of a treatable infection, the mother who burned to death when her dress caught fire from a candle, the farmer who lost his entire winter food supply to a barn fire, the woman who aged decades in years from the physical demands of manual labor. These are not experiences to be romanticized or longed for. But the pre-electric world did contain elements, community connection, intimate knowledge of nature, physical competence, the ability to find satisfaction in simple pleasures, a deep and regular experience of darkness and silence and stars that our electrified world has diminished or destroyed. And acknowledging this loss, even as we celebrate the extraordinary gains of electrification, is part of understanding our own history and our own humanity.